All right, if you are just joining us, we are in Proverbs, and what we're looking at are 9 different life principles from Proverbs directly that help us live a better life. We've made this statement all the way through that you will have a better life if you live according to God's principles. And today I want to talk with you about the principle of setting or establishing healthy boundaries. So out there online, if you keep that in your mind, we're going to look at a healthy boundaries today. Now I want you to envision with me for a moment, you go home this afternoon, the fathers you are, if you've got kids or family or whatever you're with, you're treated to a wonderful, lavish meal. You're catered and all those kinds of things that we know. Those are going to happen this afternoon, right? Guys, this is our one day to take advantage of getting treated special. So you imagine you go home this afternoon, you're treated well, you get a knock at the door, and you go and you make the mistake of opening the door before you check who it is, and you realize that the person who's there, you don't know them at all. The person introduces himself as a traveling salesman. And they're not just any traveling salesman. They introduce themselves as a traveling interior designer. And they say to you that they want to decorate the inside of your home with a pink flamingo motif. And they go on, he's got his suitcase with all of his demonstrations there and what this is going to look like to decorate the inside of your home with a pink flamingo motif. And I know there's all of you. You would handle it a lot of different ways. For many of you, you would not have even answered the door. I get that. But for those of you who did, you would have given the person a little bit of courtesy, a little bit of time to kind of explain. Others of you, you would have shut them down really, really quick. But here's what I'm just venturing, and here's what I'm guessing, that there's not one person here who at the end of this presentation, they said they want to decorate the inside of your home with a pink flamingo motif. There's not one person who would have said, sure, go ahead. Every one of us, at some point in the conversation, you might have been a little more gracious or diplomatic about the way that you did it, but all of us at some point, we would have said no. We would have said, I'm going to draw a line, and I'm going to communicate to you, no, I don't want you coming in and being the interior designer of my home, certainly when you're going to come in and put in something that I don't want, that doesn't belong here. All of us, when it comes to physical boundaries, we intuitively understand. We understand that in our home, we should be the ones who dictate who gets in and who stays out, what the home looks like. What we don't often, I think, recognize is that while that principle is true physically, that principle is also true emotionally, relationally, financially, in the same way that we need boundaries physically. And we have no problem setting physical boundaries when it comes to things like our home. In the same way that we have physical boundaries, we also need boundaries in every other area of our lives as well. And the truth is today that God, your Father, wants to be your interior designer. He wants to be the one who dictates and determines what's inside of your heart. He wants to be the one who determines what your soul looks like. But if you don't have proper boundaries, your interior designer. My guess is that there are some of you who you have had a relationship in the past, perhaps some of you have a relationship now, where somebody else is dictating what happens inside of you emotionally. Somebody else is dictating what you worry about. Somebody else is dictating how you feel about yourself. Somebody else is dictating what you're doing with your life, what you're pursuing. And all of us need to understand the need for help. And so what we're going to look at today from Proverbs are 5 healthy boundaries that we can implement into our lives so that we can have good, healthy relationships with others. So if we look at this idea of boundaries, you may want to ask yourself this question as we get started to kind of determine how your boundaries are. Are you the kind of person who at times you have a difficult time saying no to others? Are you the kind of person who, if you know that you have to reject what somebody wants or say no to what somebody wants, it really, really aches you? Are you in your life right now enabling someone else's poor or immature behavior? Another way to ask it would be this, is if you were to stop doing what you're doing for someone else, would their immature or poor behavior have to end? Perhaps you're on the other side of that equation and your boundaries are so rigid and so firm that you've cut people off and out of your life, and it's God's desire that He would want you to bring them closer to you as opposed to pushing them further away. As we open up and we look at what Solomon has to say here about boundaries, we're going to get a good feel for what God's heart is for them. So a few things to understand about boundaries. If we want to define what they are, first of all, a boundary is simply this. It is a line that distinguishes what is yours from what is someone else's. So in any area of your life, you look at this physically, you look at this emotionally, you look at this relationally, financially, a boundary is you essentially understanding this is what belongs to me. This is what God has given me. This is what God has given you. So that's what a boundary is. If you go back to Genesis, chapters 1 through 3, we find that God established the idea of a boundary in the Garden of Eden when He told Adam and Eve, you've got this entire realm of freedom, this whole garden. But there's one place you need to avoid, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You're not to partake of this tree. God gave them a boundary. God gave the people a boundary when He gave them the 10 Commandments. There was this whole realm of freedom. The people could live and enjoy and pursue life, but those 10 Commandments were boundaries. And what we need to understand from this is that when we transgress, when we step over those boundaries, we hurt not only ourselves, but the people around us. And so a boundary is essentially this line that separates this is mine, this is yours. I don't cross this particular area. Now, a few general thoughts about boundaries. The first is to understand this, that a boundary is really, it's a means to a greater end. And specifically, the ultimate goal of a boundary is healthy connection, not separation. And so one of the ways we can get boundaries wrong is to believe that, oh, what you're telling me now is I have an annoying person in my life. I have an uncle or an aunt or a family member. They have driven me crazy for the last 12 years, and I'm now free to shut them out. If we're not careful, maybe that's just my interpretation of what I'm bringing to this message, but if we're not careful, we'll misunderstand the heart of God for boundaries. And we'll conclude that boundaries are something that give us free permission to harden our hearts toward other people. That's not what boundaries are at all. God's heart ultimately is for union and connection, and boundaries are a means to that end. The idea behind a boundary is you're establishing a healthy, safe zone that allows you to have a healthy relationship with another person. So the ultimate goal of a boundary is healthy connection, not separation. Second thing to understand is this, that boundaries can minimize hurt and abuse. They cannot heal hurt and abuse. So we're going to look here at 5 boundaries from Proverbs in just a moment. And what you're going to realize is that when you look at these boundaries, if boundaries were a medical intervention, they would be similar to, if you remember David, the boy in the bubble from the 80s and 90s. For those of you who that predates you, there was a boy named David, and because of his weakened immune system, he wasn't able to be around other people, so he lived literally in a bubble. And what that bubble did for him is that it kept him safe from germs and disease and sickness, but the bubble couldn't create life. And so boundaries for us, when we establish them, they can help minimize some hurt and abuse, but they're not going to bring life. We need to understand that. The last thing is this. Boundaries should be one of many tools in your relational toolbox. Boundaries, again, they're not the end-all, be-all. They're not going to create a healthy relationship, but they can definitely minimize some pain, some abuse, some dysfunction. And my guess is, or some of you, as we look at these 5 boundaries, you need to establish at least one or more of them in your life today. So here we go. Boundary number 1 that Solomon gives us is in Proverbs 25:17, and it is simply this. It is physical boundaries, physical boundaries. We're going to go through and see 5 boundaries, then on the back end, how we actually establish these into our lives. Proverbs 25:17 says, "Let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will become weary of you and hate you." He's speaking here to an actual physical boundary. Now, a number of ways that this can be applied. If you think about in your context where you live today, this may be the case that you need space, like physical space, in a certain area of your life, with family, with friends. It could be that maybe you've made the decision, you've gone into business with somebody who is a friend or a family member. For some folks, that works really well. For others of you, you may realize this is not the best thing. Others of you, literally, it could be you've got someone living in your home and it is exhausting you, and it is time for you to try to cut the cord and have a conversation and say, we need some physical space here. We need to implement a physical boundary. So one type is a physical boundary. The second type of boundary is an emotional boundary. An emotional boundary. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life." Now, this is such a powerful principle. We could talk an entire sermon just about this boundary here. But what he's saying here is that your heart is the center of everything that makes you who you are. And so you need to guard, you need to look over everything that comes into your heart. So if you think about your emotions, your energy, all of the things that stir within you, you have to ask yourself the question, is there any other person whose toxic attitude is seeping into my heart? Is there any person whose toxic beliefs or toxic mentalities are coming in so that their worry is becoming my worry, their stress is becoming my stress, their anger is becoming my anger? Ask yourself this question: is there someone in your life who has a pattern of making you feel guilty and ashamed because you will not live your life the way they say you should live it? If there's someone who they are unwilling or unable to accept that you have the right to your emotions and your feelings in your life, and they just refuse to accept that, and they want to consistently impose on you, you probably need a boundary. An emotional boundary. The third boundary that he gives us here is a relationship boundary. And we can't go through, Proverbs speaks multiple times in multiple ways about relationship boundaries. Solomon, he talks about friendship boundaries. In Proverbs 22, verses 24 and 25, he says, "Do not associate with a man given to anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, or you will learn his ways and find a snare for yourself." So it's talking about friendships there. Who you align yourself with makes a difference. You need to establish a boundary in your friendships. He speaks of dating and marriage. And I only feel emboldened to share this on Father's Day. I wouldn't share this on Mother's Day. But Proverbs 21:9. "It is better to live in a corner of a roof than in a house shared with a contentious woman." It's what Solomon said. I didn't make this up here. Now, if you think about Solomon, I don't know if we would say hypocritical would be the right word, but he was a man who, we know he had around 700 wives, 300 concubines. The guy probably knew what he was talking about here on this issue. But we also find Proverbs 5, him saying this in verse 15, "Drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well." And he goes on to encourage not spreading your waters elsewhere, not engaging in any relationship outside of that which you are called to. So we see here a number of ways he speaks to the dating and marriage boundaries in conflict. He says this, Proverbs 9, verses 7 and 8. He says, "He who corrects a scoffer gets dishonor for himself, and he who reproves a wicked man gets insults for himself. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you." So all throughout, he talks about these relationship boundaries that we need to establish. This is an area that belongs to me. That is an area that belongs to you. Fourth type of boundary he mentions are financial boundaries. We draw a line and say, this is my responsibility, this is yours. Proverbs 22, verses 26 and 27. He says, do not be among those who give pledges, among those who become guarantors for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should he take your bed from under you? So the idea is you don't want to become the kind of person who's obligated for somebody else's financial responsibilities. And this could take a number of forms, from co-signing for a loan to bailing somebody out financially. You need to be sensitive to and aware of the potential need for boundaries in this area. The last boundary is this, just to kind of give you a summary survey, are these. Number 5, energy and responsibility boundaries. Now, this is a key one for all of you who think, well, none of the others have really hit home with me. Most likely this one will. Proverbs 19:19 says, a man of great anger will bear the penalty for, and listen to this boundary, for if you rescue him, you will only have to do it again. The idea is, if you go in and you try to save someone, you're their deliverer, you try to help them in a way that some situation they've gotten themselves into, you're just going to have to do it again. And here's what I'm probably aware of. There are many of you who you've lived through this, and you can testify to the truth of these things, that if you go in and you save an irresponsible person, they don't learn from the error of their ways. They only do the same thing again. So you need to be aware of where you invest your time, where you invest your energy. Jesus would say it like this, Matthew chapter 7. He says, do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine. The idea is you need to be judicious. You need to be discerning as to where you exert your influence and your energy. And it may be the case that you need to establish an energy and a responsibility boundary. And so the summation of all of this, we see these 5 boundaries. The principle we see is this. Life principle number 5, establish healthy boundaries. And here's the key. Don't let someone else's irresponsibility become your responsibility. And when I was in college, I was discipled by a man named Bobby Lipscomb. And every week I would go in and he would talk with me. I would share life. And one of the most important kind of life-transforming things he said to me as I walked through and navigated different situations, he said, Brian, you need to know this, that you're responsible to people, not for people. And when we look at what Solomon is teaching us here, the idea is we have a responsibility to people. We see both Old and New Testament. We've got a responsibility to people, but where God helps us draw a line, where God helps us establish a boundary, is we understand this, that we're not responsible for people. We saw a picture of this earlier when we have this child dedication. There's a period of time where parents are directly responsible for the livelihoods of their children. That's true when they're 4. But by the time they get 40, that's not the case any longer. There has to be a transition in our thinking and a clear understanding that God's called us to be responsible to people, not for people. Now, if you've been with us through this series, you know one of the first principles we talked about was the principle of personal responsibility. This idea that God has called us to be personally responsible, kind of the ones who are in charge of our own lives. Connected to that principle of personal responsibility is a principle of sowing and reaping. The idea being there that the choices we make today, they affect the circumstances of our lives in the future. And what happens when we don't respect the boundaries of others and when we don't set boundaries ourselves? When we try to be responsible for someone, not just to someone, we interfere with that God-given principle of sowing and reaping. If you think about this from the parent's perspective, which is easy for us to grasp, if you have a child that never understands that when they do this, there is a consequence for it, they never learn. So in our household right now, I've got a grand vision for our future. And that grand vision for our future is that when people leave the room, they turn the light out. I don't know if you've ever had that vision in your home, but it's like, for the love, can you please turn the light out? And so what we do in our home, like Erin, she has a penny system right now. And the penny system, I thought it was pretty ingenious, pretty clever. She basically, if they do something that we want to say, yes, that's good, they get a penny. If they do something like they leave out, don't turn off the light, whatever, take a penny away. It may take us 10 years to get it figured out, but I'm confident eventually we're going to learn how to turn the lights out. But here's the thing. If we continue to rescue others from God-given consequences, I mean, be direct here. If you continue to rescue others from God-given consequences, you're interfering with the way God has designed this world to operate. And so what we have to see here is this principle of sowing and reaping, that our choices today impact our lives tomorrow, the circumstances of our lives, when we go in and we don't honor boundaries. We don't honor the idea that this is your area, this is my area. What we do in the end is we interrupt, we interfere, we compromise this God-given principle of sowing and reaping. And so this idea of boundaries here, we need to understand the best thing perhaps you can do for some of the people in your life to help them grow, to help them lean into God, to help them look to Him as their provider, not you, is to stop enabling. It's to stop rescuing them from the choices that they are making. And I get right now there are probably 10 excuses that you're stirring up in your mind and you're saying, well, yes, but you need to ask yourself this question. If you feel like their negative behavior is in part dependent upon you, how long will you be content to support that? And if you want to, for the duration of your life, continue to enable and support in kind of a codependent way, okay. But you're operating against this principle. So we ask the question, how do we begin to establish these healthy boundaries into our lives? I want to give you kind of 6 keys, 6 steps here. The first is this, number 1, if you say, I would love to begin establishing healthy boundaries, where do I start? Number 1 is this, is to determine if this is something God holds you responsible for. This is such a powerful thing. I cannot overstate how significant it is to step back from the situation. And maybe you're wedded to, or you're kind of bound up in somebody else's irresponsible behavior. You probably have never stepped back and asked the question, hold on, is this something that God holds me responsible for, or the other person? And here's a good answer to that. If it has to do with somebody else's actions or attitude, provided they're not a young child in your home, guess what? You're not responsible for that. Somebody else's decisions, somebody else's choices, those are not things that you're responsible to. And there's incredible power just by stepping back and realizing, this is not something that God has called me to be responsible for. But until you answer this question, until you figure out, is this what God has called me to be responsible for or not, you're always going to be confused. And with that confusion, there's a sense of guilt, a sense of pressure, a sense of, oh, I know I should be helping this person. Ask yourself this question. Figure out, is this something that I'm responsible for or the other person? The second is this. Number 2, how do we begin to establish healthy boundaries? Is learn to say this powerful word, the word no. The power in this is when you say no to being the person's rescuer You open up an environment for God to be that. When you say no to being the person's provider, you open up an opportunity for God to be that. When you say no in any area where there's a clear boundary and a clear line, what you're doing is you're entrusting that God is able to care for that person. An inability to say no is a symptom of mistrust. It is a symptom that you don't trust God enough to care for, provide for, fill in what is needed in the life of this other person. One writer named Nina Brown, she talks about different types of boundaries, and she says that there are soft boundaries, rigid boundaries, and then flexible boundaries. And so if you're a person who you have soft boundaries, you're not exactly sure where you should draw the line in any area, it's likely the case that it's easy for other people to manipulate you. It's easy for other people to get you to feel bad about the choices that you're making, the values that you hold. And if you have a soft boundary, what you need to understand is that God has called you to be responsible for yourself, not for the lives of other people. He's put worth and value in you, so your sense of self doesn't depend on your ability to rescue others, to save others. If you've got a rigid boundary, you're on the opposite end of the spectrum. And for those of you who may have a rigid boundary, the problem you have is not that you're unwilling to create a boundary. The problem is that you're too quick to cut people off. And this is really core, I think, for us to understand this whole conversation about boundaries. God's desire for you is not to harden your heart and cut people off entirely. That there is a time and a place to establish healthy boundaries emotionally, relationally, financially, physically, in all these areas of our lives. But the end goal of that boundary is not for you to walk away and say, I don't have to care about that person any longer. So if you have a rigid boundary, you may need to be the kind of person who learns not just to say no, but at times how to say yes. So the third step, the third way that we apply this is very simply to stop making excuses for their behavior. And I know this, there are some of you who you've enabled poor behavior, and you can probably think back to a time in your past, and the justification you've had is, but look what they've been through. Look at how terrible they've had it. It's easy for you to excuse or to justify their behavior. And you just need to know this, that if God holds them accountable for their behavior, so can you. And you don't have to continue excusing it. Number 4, and this is key, establish consequences when others act in an inappropriate way. The consequence is simply this, that if you do this, I will do this. You're not negative, you're not mean-spirited about it, but you're very clear. And you need to understand this, that a boundary without a consequence is a wish. That if you are entangled with someone else and you're supporting, enabling in any way, there's no clear boundary there in what they're doing. If you don't establish what the consequence is when they cross that boundary, things are never going to change. And so the fifth is this. Number 5, communicate your boundaries to the other relevant persons without an expectation that they will agree or support your boundary. Some of you, as I'm sharing this, the thought going on in your mind is, I would love to have a conversation with whoever the person is. I would love to sit down and talk with them about this, but I know if I do, they're going to reject it. Has anybody had that thought? Don't raise your hand. The idea is, well, I would do this, but I know they won't respond well. That's exactly the reason that you need a boundary. An indicator that you need a boundary in a relationship is if you're reluctant to communicate to the other person what your boundary is because you're afraid of how they'll respond. The truth is this, People who don't respect boundaries, when you establish a healthy boundary, will make you the problem. They'll say to you, how could you be so ungrateful? How could you be so uncaring? Aren't you a Christian? Is this the way Jesus would be? A person who doesn't respect the boundaries of others will make you out to be the problem when you try to establish a healthy boundary. And that's why you go back to the first question we looked at. You determine, is this something that God has called me to be responsible for, or is it something else? So you need to have a conversation. For some of you, this may actually mean sitting down with somebody and saying, here's my role, here's my responsibility in what has happened. For others of you, the best way to do this may just be to sit down and write a letter and say to the person, look, for the last 12 years, I have supported this and I have enabled this. I am sorry for trying to play God in your life. I am sorry for taking responsibility for something that God hasn't called me to be responsible for. You acknowledge your role in the situation, but then you clearly communicate, I'm drawing a line. This no longer belongs to me, this belongs to you. The last thing is this. And this is not in your notes that you have there, but I want you to hear this, is to recognize and respect the boundaries of others. You go all the way back to Genesis, you go back to the Ten Commandments, the consistent consequence of us when we transgress, when we step into an area that is not ours, we bring pain not only to ourselves, but we bring pain to all the people who are around us. And right now, you can be sure of this. If there are unclear boundaries, there are muddy areas where you're stepping in, intervening, disrupting that cause and effect relationship, you can be sure of this, that somewhere in your family dynamics, there's dysfunction, there's jealousy, there's bitterness, there's resentment. Because when you transgress, when you step into and try to save another person, what that does inevitably is cause hard feelings. It causes resentment. If not for the person that you're trying to rescue, for everyone else who's out there looking at that and saying, why didn't pain and dysfunction? Now, let me close with this. If you think about how to take this and apply it to your life and kind of cement it in your heart, one of the things to understand about the character of God with regard to boundaries is that God could have established a boundary between himself and us and never crossed it. God could have established a boundary and said, this is what they deserve, this is what they're going to get, and just let us be to ourselves. But again, the ultimate heart of God is union, it's connection, it's not separation, it's not isolation. I would encourage you to consider this, that when you want to implement one of these healthy boundaries, somewhere in your heart, the driving motive would be that at some point, because you're establishing this boundary, you're drawing a line, you're communicating, this is mine and that is yours. The ultimate goal behind this is to have a healthy connection and a healthy relationship with that other person. It's not to cut them off entirely. It's you understanding that the heart of God is for you to have restoration in your relationships, not just separation. And so I encourage you with this today. If you're at a place where you feel like God is distant from you for whatever reason, that God has established a boundary and he's never going to cross over that because of things you've done, we look to the cross of Christ as the ultimate model and the ultimate example of God's desire to reconnect with us, to have union with us. And God's desire for you today is to be in union with him. And so as you establish these boundaries in your life, you get them embedded firmly, understand that God's heart for you ultimately is to be in union with him and it's to be in union with other people. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the way that you speak to us and you bring your word to life. And for any person who is here today and they're struggling with one of these boundaries, it's difficult for them to know how to establish an emotional boundary or a financial or physical. Whatever the issue may be, I pray for wisdom and I pray for discernment. I pray that they'll be able to see that they're not responsible for other people. We have a responsibility to love, to care, to be supportive of and bear burdens. But at the end of the day, we're not responsible for other people. And so out of that, I pray you would give us a freedom and just kind of a lightheartedness just to approach and move into the future with a sense of liberty and a sense of release that you have called us to be responsible for ourselves and to others. We pray this in the great name of Jesus. Amen.